Today, we're going to take some time to talk about the expansion of Europe exploration during the 14, 15, and 1600s, the colonization that took place during that time, and the establishment of slavery. The 1400s were a unique time in European history. During that time, we're beginning to see the rumblings of the scientific revolution. We're seeing the Renaissance begin to move to a new height. And we're also going to begin to see European nations begin to set out for exploration purposes. And one of the biggest questions to ask is why, during the late 1400s, early 1500s, did Europe begin exploration? Why didn't she do it 100 years later, or why didn't it happen 100 years earlier? And so we're going to go through some of the reasons why Europe began exploration in the late 1400s, and then take a look at how that exploration evolved. Several reasons why Europe began exploration in the late 1400s. The first one was because of population growth in Europe. Europe was experiencing a population boom after the effects of the Black Death. The bubonic plague, or the Black Death, had hit Europe in the mid 1300s and wiped out about 1/3 of the European population from the mid 1300s until the late 1300s. During the 1400s, we are watching Europe begin to rebuild. We're watching population begin to expand, and she is experiencing a population boom by the late 1400s. Also, the desire for new trade routes to acquire the goods that were in Asia specifically and in the areas around the Middle East meant that people began to look outward away from the land trade routes, which were so common during this time. Advancements in shipbuilding and navigation were another reason why Europeans began exploration. A new ship was created called the caravel. This ship was a faster ship. It was smaller. It had a little bit better cargo space. And the Nina, the Pinta, the Santa Maria, Christopher Columbus's ships, those were all caravels. And so this kind of new innovation pushed people out into what's called maritime exploration, or exploration by means of the water. Also, new navigational tools. There are some new maps being created, an updated compass. All of these are helping, again, to move Europeans out into the maritime world. The desire for commercial growth, as we watch the arrival and the establishment of kings and queens in Europe. They want to build commerce. They want to build a base of a strong economy, and so they want more goods. Specifically, they want a lot of those goods from the Eastern world, from the Asian world as well. The desire to spread the Christian religion is another reason why, especially after the Protestant Reformation in the mid 1500s. We're going to watch Protestants and Catholics begin to move out to share their faith and to begin an education program in a number of places around the world. The two nations that were at the forefront of European exploration were Portugal and Spain. And there's a good reason why. Portugal had really nowhere else to go. If you look at where she's located on a map, you will see that she is bound by water and the nation of Spain. And she had no means of expanding economically outside of moving out into the waters. Henry the Navigator was a Portuguese prince who opened up a navigation school. And in this school, he taught the latest forms of navigation. He taught how to use the caravels. He provided the updated compasses. And a number of our early explorers went through Prince Henry's school, including Columbus. The beginnings of Portugal moving out into exploration began in 1488 when Bartholomew Diaz sailed down the western coast of Africa and accidentally sailed around the southern tip of Africa. When this happened, his crew, of course, threatened to mutiny. They freaked out that they were going so far off land, off of course. But it proved that you could go around the southern tip of Africa and make your way over to India and the Indian market, the Asian market, by means of ship. And so 10 years later, Vasco da Gama boarded his ships and sailed around the southern tip of Africa, arrived in India, and established a base for Portuguese trade in the Indian market. This allowed for the first time to have goods from India and from the Asian market to work their way up into Europe by means of maritime ships, as well as the goods that were highly desired by the Europeans during this time. Columbus set sail on behalf of Spain in 1492, and he headed complete westward. He believed that he could reach the Asian markets without going around the southern tip of Africa, but going straight west. Unbeknownst to him, there was a hemisphere there, our hemisphere, North and South America, and he and his crew landed in the islands there. They are going to trade goods back and forth. We are going to see the expansion of more Spanish begin to move into these islands. And eventually, as Spain began to move into the islands down in what is now the Caribbean Sea, we are going to see a battle begin established between Portugal and Spain over who gets to control this area. It became evident that there was land over here, falsely believing it was Indian or Asian land, but that there was land here and means of having and acquiring new types of goods. And so Portugal and Spain, along with the Pope, entered into an agreement with this new land. And they came up with a treaty on how to divide this new land up. This treaty was called the Treaty of Tordesillas. And what it did was it drew an imaginary line through the earth. This imaginary line was about, what was it, 1,500 miles west of the Canary Islands. And it said all of the land that was found east of this line will go to Portugal, and all of the land that is found west of this line will go to Spain. Well, if you take a look at it on the map, you'll see that Portugal really only got the far eastern tip of South America, which is Brazil. And in Brazil, of course, they speak Portuguese. And Spain will end up being able to claim the rest of South America and the islands, and they speak Spanish in those islands. As the Spanish continue to come over into the New World, conquistadors come in. These are conquerors, and they are going to establish Spanish rule and defeat the Aztecs and the Incas that are located there. Spain's approach to the New World is called Encomienda. And what this means is that Spain is going to, on paper, set up an agreement with the Indians. They were called the Indians because it was believed that they were in the Indies. And the idea of Encomienda is that the Indians will work the land and pay tribute to Spain in return for protection and provision. In reality, encomienda was the use of the Indian natives as forced labor to strip these lands in the Caribbean and in South America of its goods and send those goods back to Spain. And so through encomienda, we're going to watch the decimation of the Indian population in islands such as Hispaniola, especially, and in the area that will become known as Mexico. We're going to watch the populations drastically fall, along with the effects of smallpox. The native people were not acclimated or immune to smallpox, and so with the arrival of the disease, the Spanish had brought that disease with them. We're going to watch the populations begin to decimate quite a bit. We're going to begin to see the establishment of what becomes known as the triangular trade. And this is a creation of a triangle basically through the Atlantic Ocean that is going to be established for goods to be sent back to Europe and for slaves to be sent over to the New World to work the land. As time continued to progress in the 1500s, it became evident that this was new land, that this was a separate hemisphere. And so as Spain was claiming land, eventually England will also want to get in on the mix. France will get in on the mix as well, and they will begin to claim their spots. And we will begin to see the European powers dividing up the North and South American areas. To work this plantation type of land, we are going to need workers. And so the very first workers that came over were indentured servants, and then eventually that morphed into slaves. Slavery was established in the New World primarily in the areas around the Caribbean Sea because of the expansion and the success of the sugar plantations. The sugar plantations down in those islands meant that you had to constantly have workers, and so African men and women who were vulnerable to being exploited during this time. There was a lot of poverty in Africa during this time, became the prime candidates for bringing those men and women to the New World and enslaving them for the purpose of working the land. Slavery will become established in those islands. And the idea with the triangular trade is that goods would come down from specifically Europe, but excuse me, Britain, but Europe down to Africa. Those goods would be traded for men and women who would become slaves. And then those slaves were put on ships. They were carried across to the islands and eventually, sometimes up to what will become America. And they were exchanged for raw goods, for natural resources. Those raw goods and natural resources were put on ships. They were sent back up to Britain, and there they were created, or they became goods that were then resources to be sold back to the colonists or sold to the British, etc. And so the triangular trade is going to become a dynamic of moving not only goods but people across the Atlantic Ocean for about 300 years. During that time, about 11 to 12 million African men and women will come across the second leg of the triangular trade by means of what's called the Middle Passage. They will be put onto slave ships, brought across, and sold. Of that 11 to 12 million, about 600,000 ended up in what is now America. All the rest of those men and women ended up in the islands. And that can just help you understand so much more the death rate of the people that were working in those islands during this time.